This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we'll get started. I'm glad there's a few people interested in oak wilt.
Drove all the way to Sudbury.
Yes. So this session in room 2, this is going to be our Beyond Ontario's Borders session. So this is the Ontario Forum, but the point of this session is to focus on how collaboration across borders is vitally important with invasive species, because we all know that invasive species don't respect any provincial or international borders. So this session is going to speak to how Ontario can be working with jurisdictions within Canada and also beyond Canada to address invasive species. So our first presenter today is Philip Kurgea. Philip has worked for the Forest Resource Division of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources for almost 10 years. During that time, he worked as a forest health technician running the oak wilt mapping and community outreach program, as well as a number of other statewide forest pest surveys working with parks and recreation staff and volunteers across the state. He is widely considered one of the most skilled oak wilt field diagnosticians in Michigan. He currently works for American Arbor LLC, where he is the plant healthcare specialist, one-man show servicing an area that covers most of the state of Michigan. So welcome, Philip.
That's all true because I wrote it. All right, so oak wilt. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Invasive Species Center for asking me to come here for this talk. We've done a number of talks across southern Ontario, and there's been some training sessions where we've tried to qualify members of municipalities, arborists across southern Ontario and Michigan. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and thanks everybody for coming. All right. So oak wilt is a disease that when it shows up in woodlots, it's very easy to see. You know, you'll see these expanding epicenters with newly flagging symptomatic trees on the outside of the periphery. So these are all oak wilt pockets across these small woodland areas. But more often than not, it shows up and you get a phone call because it's one tree that looked great, and then all of a sudden 2 weeks later, all of its leaves are on the ground. Okay, and this is the best way to find it. When it's like this, that's just one tree, as opposed to when it's this, when it's a lot more trees in a lot larger area that has to be treated. Okay, so here's Ontario's oak resources, as you can see, basically centered as part of the province down here. Low impact, low occurrence up here, and so we all kind of understand this. There's not a lot up here, more down here, right? So this is the slide where I'm supposed to make you care that if you guys get oak wilt, it's going to be a problem. I don't think that's necessary in this group, is it? Right? But just because, let's go over it. Forest products worth billions, recreation, tourism, trees increase property value, contribute to air quality, and for those of you who still don't care, let's talk about the ecological implications that directly lead to food chains. We've got pink-striped oakworm, dagger moth, red-humped oakworm, and of course, these are all important because these are food for lots of different bird species, right? So this is important, right? Because what kind of monster doesn't care about baby birds? All right? So now that we all understand how important it is, oak wilt distribution as of 2002, this is county level data for the United States. Okay? Let's zoom into what's more important for you guys up this way. But first of all, let's go. So dying oaks are first noticed in Wisconsin, 1881, a little bit of history. 1944, it's identified in the causal agent later named Ceratocystis fagacearum. Of course, 1970s, 1990s, it greatly expands into the Lake States, into Texas, and in 2018 it has been renamed as Bretsilia fagacearum. Of course, now here's Michigan, right? And one of the things I always think is most interesting about maps from the States is that, there's never anything here. It's like what is here, It's like here BC monsters or something, on all of these maps. But anyway, so moving along, so here once again we got 2005. There was county level data, not very helpful. This could be 1, this could be 15, right? So moving along to 2014, when I started working for the DNR, we wanted more data. We wanted better data. I wanted to know where these sites were. So these are pretty much all me. 2014, we've got no known, so never been found before, confirmed, right? Historic reports, no recent confirmations. These are the conundrums right here. This means that somebody at some time, somewhere, sent in a sample to one of the labs that does the confirmation work. And this could be 1, this could be 15. And there's no way of knowing because that's privileged information. The homeowner would have to be contacted and give permission to release that data to be able to put it on this map. So all we have is county level data as far as that goes. Right, moving along, 2014, 2015, 2016, oh, what happened there? What's this? Where did this guy come from? Look at that. What did he do? Nothing? And then, boom, green dot. What's that? Anybody know? David.
Is it Belle Isle?
It is Belle Isle, right down there, right in the Detroit River. We've got Belle Isle State Park, and these confirmation spots are just 574 meters from Windsor. So this is active. This is still active on the island. So here we are. Let's get to biology. For those of you who understand already, is everybody here an expert on oak wilt? Raise your hand. No? Okay, we'll go over biology. You are.
No.
Oh, that was funny though. It's like I know everything. All right, so we're going to start with this disease wheel, okay? This is the life cycle wheel. So oak wilt can be spread in 2 ways. This is our current understanding of the pathogen, by the way. Oak wilt spreads in 2 ways. The nididulid beetle, which is fed on a pressure pad, and we'll get to the pressure pads in a minute, lands on a newly wounded tree. The good thing about this beetle is that it doesn't have the chewing mouth parts to inflict wounds. If it did, this would be a lot more difficult to control. The beetle has to land on a freshly wounded tree, okay? It has to leave a pressure pad with the spores on it and land on a freshly wounded tree. That tree then becomes infected, becomes symptomatic, loses its leaves, gets the vascular discoloration, and then depending on the time of year that it becomes infected, it can produce these pressure pads either later in the fall, the year it was infected, or the following spring if it was infected later on in the year. We all clear on this? Okay? So the pressure pads form and the cycle repeats itself. This is overland spread. Below ground spread happens once this tree dies, and dies. The above ground portion of it becomes symptomatic and the vascular tissues are plugged up. The disease then moves into the ground and goes through root grafts. And then so that's when you get those expanding pockets where you have 1 tree, goes to 6 trees, goes to 25 trees. You know, it just continues to spread until it runs out of red oak resource. Okay, so those are your 2 ways. We just talked about that. We got overland, we got below ground. Okay. As we said, overland transmission, root graft transmission. This can occur. So this, depending on who you talk to, April through September in the Great Lakes regions, depending on multiple factors such as host, vectors, and environmental factors. Root graft contact, it can spread basically throughout the growing season, as long as it's warm enough for the roots and the fungus or either or to be metabolically active. Okay? The nididulin, which is the vector, is a very small bug. It's a native bug. It's attracted to sweet smells. If you've ever been at a picnic and you've been eating a slice of watermelon or something sweet, and these little beetles are flying around your head, that's them. They're attracted to sweet smells, and they're also attracted to the smell of wounded trees. The pathogen gives off a smell that's very much like fermenting apple cider, juicy fruit bubble gum. My mentor, Bill Cook, says that it smells like a good vanilla ale. So definitely that sweet, fermented kind of odor. Okay, root grafts occur in the same subgenus, tend to form grafts very easily. Between reds and whites, less common. There's actually some new research coming out that may suggest that it's a little bit more common than was first thought. So, but we're waiting for that to come out. So, symptomatic red oak leaves. If you see these, this is a good hint. This is not diagnostic. A lot of people will walk into a yard. They'll see those leaves on the ground. They'll say, oak wilt, and boom, drop the mic. It's not how it works. Okay, you don't do that. Like I said, there's only 2 ways that you can tell. One is through a pressure pad, and the other way is through a lab confirmation. Oak wilt hosts, red oaks are most susceptible. Burr is considered intermediary, and white is considered resistant tolerance. So it still gets the disease, it's just better at compartmentalizing it and fighting it off. Okay? Once again, red's highly susceptible, white's low susceptibility. In the white oak group, white oak, it's often just basically like part of the usual suspects that lead to the mortality of the tree. Oak wilt's there, two-line chestnut borer is there, armillaria is there, long-term decline, eventually the tree dies. Red oaks, I've seen healthy trees go from completely green foliage looking great to everything's on the ground in about 2 weeks. It's rather spectacular when it happens with the red oaks. Okay? White oak symptoms, yeah, that's not a bad photograph of that. I've not been able to find a better one. Spore mats form mainly on the red oaks, seldom found on white oaks. I've been doing this for more than 10 years. I've looked at literally thousands of sites, and I've never seen a spore mat on a white oak. I'm waiting for that day. The day that I find the spore mat on a white oak would be like seeing Bigfoot riding a unicorn through the woods. And I'm waiting for that day, but never found it yet. And we're going to get into pressure pads. Once again, talking about field ID, you can do it either with a pressure pad or you can do it with a lab confirmation. We're talking right now about pressure pads and how do you know whether you found a pressure pad and how do you look for it. Okay? Oak wilt spore mats, as I said, form under the bark. You can see these pictures. These are okay pictures. Get into some more here in a minute. Okay? So this right here is the grain sort of texture of the pressure pad under the bark. And what right here is the little nidulid, so you can see exactly how small that is. This is like a pocket knife here, and there is that, and here's the little nidulid. They're very small, maybe just a little bit bigger than the tip and then the head of a pin. Okay? So now we're going to look at a whole bunch of different pictures of pressure pads. So on several occasions where there are trees that I knew were susceptible, that I knew succumbed to oak wilt, the fall of the previous summer and fall came back early spring, January or February, and started peeling the bark back. And the smell that comes out from underneath the bark is just prolific. And you usually see these, what I would call pressure pad primordia. You know, this is just the white hyphal streaking under the bark. No pressure pad itself is yet formed. However, on several occasions when I've taken samples of these, because it smells like oak wilt, it's white hyphal mass, it's a fungus of some sort, but am I sure it's oak wilt? Took it into the lab to be cultured, and before they could be cultured, sitting in Ziploc bags on a bench in the lab, they popped and produced pressure pads, just sitting there on the bench. So, seen that on a couple of different occasions, and that's basically what that says. So here we have, you can see this crack here, this vertical crack in the bark. Okay, so they're not easy to see, but you can listen for them. If you're looking for pressure pads on a tree, you can take a hatchet or something and you can drum on the tree and you'll hear a difference. You'll hear a hollow spot. So if you think you found the crack, do a little bit of drumming, listen for the difference in sound between the tighter bark and the looser bark. So here we go again. This is with half of it removed. We're all seeing we're all looking at the same thing, right? We got the intact tree. Pulled the bark off half of the crack. There's part of it that's exposed, right? And then this is the whole piece of bark peeled off. And that's what you're seeing. This is a very fresh pressure pad, okay? Notice that white hyphal mass, okay? And that lighter gray in the center. Okay, once again, we've got pressure pad 1. There's the same one with the bark peeled open. Pressure pad 2 and pressure pad 2. Okay? As they start to get older, that gray mat in the middle becomes darker. Okay? The bright hyphal mass also becomes a little bit more gray, and eventually that pressure pad increases and gets darker as the pad ages. Once again, got that same picture. Eventually the outer part becomes dark. Okay? Now this is some interesting done here again with the nididulids. You can see those in the, as a matter of fact, I think this might be on one of the posters over there that they were showing. But anyway, right here, got some really older ones. As they start to get older, the whole mat starts to turn dark. The middle part becomes like a white powder. Okay? This is an interesting picture because what we have here is we have a very old, dark pressure pad, and then right next to it we have a brand new one. Okay? Another old dark pressure pad with a nice new one next to it. Now this was the first time I saw this. So the way our current understanding of the disease is that if a tree becomes infected, it becomes symptomatic, and then once the pressure pads on that tree have dried out, the tree is no longer infectious. But what we have here, as you can see, this is the same picture, right? This tree, these pressure pads are more than a year old, and this is a brand new one. So what does this mean for how we handle the wood, right? If what it's understood is that you walk into a stand and all the older dead trees are no longer infectious because they've already produced their pressure pads, they're done. This is completely different. So this means that trees that might be sent off to be processed because they're already supposedly no longer infectious could still be infectious. And I've been doing this for, like I said, a little more than 10 years, and I've run across this about a dozen times. So what does that mean? Here again, look at this, how old this pressure pad is. So old that it's beginning to flake and fall off, and right next to it is a brand new one. So again, this wood's not supposed to be infectious, but yet it is. I don't know what it means. Just FYI. Okay, more pictures of pressure pads, more into the doolits. All right, so everybody now knows what a pressure pad looks like? You can all identify them, right? Good, fantastic. Now we're going to move on to the next part of the ID, which is the lab confirmation. So here we go. If you need to test it, now this is not PCR. This is just lab culturing of living material. So PCR is something different. That's something that's kind of new. They're just starting to offer it now at Michigan State University Diagnostic Clinic, but they're still working on the technique a little bit. So right now, the best confirmation tool we have is to culture it in a lab. All right, collecting a branch sample. Branch samples must be refrigerated and sent as soon as you can to your diagnostic lab of choice. Samples need to be from a branch that is showing symptoms, such as leaves turning color or falling off. And you're looking for 3 to 5 branch samples, 6 to 8 inches long, somewhere between your thumb and your wrist. You know, most labs don't like you sending them chunks of firewood because it's all infectious material and they have to autoclave it before they can dispose of it. So, you know, something that they can use. Now, nothing too small because small branches will dry out, and you need to have a somewhat wet sample. When collecting a sample, you're looking for this discoloration in the vascular tissue, okay? And again, samples to be taken to be still wet. So if the branch is too dry, chances are they won't be able to culture from it. And then, of course, when we're talking about that, so not up there, not up in these really dead, dry branches, but yes, in the areas where you can still see a little bit of green or some tawny color to the foliage. All right? Branch samples collecting, best time to do it is, you know, off season. So again, just whatever you've got, get it in a bag, get it to the lab as quick as possible. All right? Because there are a lot of other things that can look like oak wilt, two-line chestnut borer, armillaria, as I said, or a multitude of other things. So this is a aerial photograph taken in Crawford County, Michigan, central part, northern Michigan. There is oak wilt in here, you know, but a lot of it also is drought, gypsy moth defoliation, you know, two-line chestnut borer, everything else. And trying to ferret out the difference in this area is very difficult. But, you know, if you were to fly over that and you were to see something that looked a little bit more concentric, you might say, oh, that's an oak wilt pocket. But good luck figuring that out in there. Okay? Two-line chestnut borer usually doesn't kill the tree right away. You'll see a lot of branch dieback, you know. And when people say, oh, I think I have oak wilt, well, what do you mean? Oh, the tree's been looking bad for a few years. That's probably not oak wilt. It's probably something else. As I said, it's very spectacular when it happens. So prevention, of course, to prevent overland spread, you can use fungicides, there's removals, there's a lot of different things you can use. So let's talk about how you control it. Well, first thing is to just not get it in the first place. Don't move around firewood, don't prune your trees at the wrong time of year. And then, of course, if you do get it, there are systemic fungicides that we can use. Propiconazole is not actually available here in Ontario. I understand from some of the people I've been talking to that they're working on trying to get it listed, but it's not currently available. Okay, this is a systemic injection that you do along at the base of the tree. It is kind of expensive, depending on where you are. It could be between $10 and $20 per inch DBH. It only lasts 15 to 18 months. Every injection is causing wounds at the base of the tree. In some areas, you have to be a certified pesticide applicator to use it or even to purchase it. It's preventative for all species, but therapeutic only for white oaks, and as I believe it is not currently available in Canada. Root plate excavation. This is important because this is only when you have that first tree. So your tree becomes symptomatic. You get it confirmed, comes back as positive for oak wilt, and that year, immediately, you take it, you cut it down, and you try to yank as much of the root ball out of the ground as you possibly can. We air spaded this one quite a bit just to get an idea where all the large roots were. And then you just pull it out of the ground. And the theory behind this is that the disease has not yet had a chance to move down into the root system. And so by doing this, you are limiting the opportunities for the disease to spread to other trees in the area. As you can see from the photograph, these were all other oaks. So to trench this area, or to include all of these as possibly infectious, they would have lost maybe 20 trees. So instead, we're going to try to yank this one and then monitor it for a year or so and see if any of the other trees become symptomatic. Okay? The other way to do this is, of course, to, by the way, how am I doing on time?
You have just over 5 minutes.
Fantastic. All right, so for putting in, so instead of doing the herbicide treatments or doing the stump pulling, if you have a large pocket, you have to figure out, the extent of your possibly infected trees, and then you put in a root graft barrier, which is basically just this 5.5-foot vibrating blade that they use to trench around the pockets. Okay, it's low impact when you use this machine because it's a tracked machine and it's just the vibrating blade. So after it goes through, it's very difficult to tell where it even went through a year or so later. Use something like this, someone has to go back in and fill in the trench, right? But anything that will get 5.5 feet deep is more than enough. Where do you figure out where these trench lines go? Well, you use the Bruin model. So Dr. Johann Bruin came up with this complex equation, which essentially means the larger a tree is, the farther away its roots go. Right? I mean, that's pretty much it. The bigger the tree, the farther its roots can grow. And so what you do is that you come up with this combined DBH. So you take the nearest infected and non-infected tree, you combine those DBHs, you come up with your number, and then that tells you the 98% confidence interval that you need to use for distance from infected to non-infected tree. Kind of reads like lawnmower instructions. So let's go this way. For the purposes of training, we're going to call this a healthy, we're going to call that a newly infected flagging tree, and we're going to call that a dead infected tree. Okay? So here we have our dead infected tree. He's got 15-inch DBH. You measure to that guy, he's also 15-inch DBH. So combined DBH is 30, right? That means that they have to be at least 77 feet apart. And when you measure them, he's actually 56 feet. So that means he's probably infected already. Okay? We all get this? Okay. So he's dead, or you assume he's dead, and then you measure to the next tree. And so he's 20. So 20 and 15 always round up 35 to 36, 92 feet. And as it turns out, he's 102 feet apart. So he's probably all right. And that guy's probably all right too. So then where do we put our plow line? Oh, we put it right there. Everybody get this? Okay. Am I out of time?
You have a couple minutes. We're getting close to 2:30, but we'll start.
So I guess again, if you wanted to do a larger scenario, once again we're going to say we're going to measure. So that guy, is the closest infected tree to the trees on the left, and that guy's the closest infected or symptomatic tree to the trees on the right. Okay. So then you measure, and you say that guy's too close, that guy's too close, that guy's too close, but everybody else is okay. Right. So you put your plow line in. And you have now, so if these trees are infected, You've now prevented it from spreading underground. And what you would normally do then is you would just remove everything from inside the pocket. So, but in certain cases, such as this is a hard sell in urban areas. So a lot of times people want to try to save as many trees as they can. So sometimes you'll put in, you know, a secondary trench line. And so what this means is you've got your infected trees here, okay? You've got this plow line that you've just put in, that's the Bruin model, right? But what if this tree here, who's now inside the plow line, you don't want to remove them, or you want to try to save as many trees as you can? Well, then you can put in a secondary line. And what this does is, if this tree is infected, you've just prevented it from infecting these trees. If this tree isn't infected, this just saved it from becoming infected. We all get that? Okay. So then if you wanted to do the same thing here, you might put that secondary trench line in there, and then you would monitor that tree. You would remove all of these trees, and then you would monitor this one, because who knows? Maybe it's okay. So then you would, you know, years, if you go through 3 to 5 years, that tree doesn't show any symptoms, it's probably all right. Okay? Everybody cool? We all know what oak wilt is now and understand how to control it? Fantastic. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So the oak wilt is actually native?
As far as I understand it, it is considered, as far as Michigan is concerned, it's considered an invasive. It's considered an invasive, and it originates somewhere in Central America.
Okay.
As far as I understand it, from what we currently know about it.
Is there environmental factors that are
To its spread,
like how virulent?
how virulent it is?
Yeah.
As far as I know, it's always been as virulent as it is now. Contributing to its factors of spread are just people moving around. People moving trees, utility companies, you know, trim oak trees when they're not supposed to. People move firewood, you know. That's one of the big things that contributes to the spread. Yeah. And just people who are negligent landowners who have it on their property, don't dispose, don't take care of it, and then just let it spread to other people's properties. So.
In a situation where you have a larger potential outbreak, you need to do some dredging.
Mm-hmm.
But the landowner wants to save some trees, so you're thinking about a secondary trench. Is there any opportunity, like, what's the cost comparison for like inoculating the tree versus putting a secondary trench line? Like, are they even close in the same way? Like, seems to me the trenching wouldn't be overly expensive.
Trenching isn't that expensive, so trenching and removal is what the Department of Natural Resources does. In certain areas where it's a protected dune ecosystem, should I be stopping?
Yeah, you have time to wrap up.
For protected dune ecosystems or places where you can't get machinery and do the topography or whatever, they'll use the injection or double girdling with a chainsaw and then treating the curbside. So, you know, there's a couple of different options, but yeah, the trenching and the removals is the cheapest way to go. Injections in urban settings are usually reserved for, like, you have this huge oak tree in your front lawn, you break your heart to see it die, and you got oak wilt in the area, so you inject it for 3 to 5 years. Hopefully that's enough. Yeah. Okay?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I have a gift in a
thank you.
pink bag, just as requested. And I'd also like to add, in the Canadian context for oak wilt, we've been working really closely with Philip and some other partners to do oak wilt workshops in Ontario to get people prepared for what they're looking for, how to report it, and how to manage it if it does get to that situation. In Ontario, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has the capacity to do the lab tests that Philip was talking about. So if you do have a suspect tree that you think might be oak wilt, contact your Canadian Food Inspection Agency representative, and they can come and help with the sampling and getting the branch samples and taking it to the lab to do the diagnosis that Philip was talking about. So with that, we'll move on to our next presentation for the day. We have Dr. Ryan Brook that's come here all the way from the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Ryan Brook is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. His interdisciplinary research team is focused on several areas, including the wildlife-livestock interface, working with Aboriginal people, linking traditional and local knowledge with science, youth engagement in field research, and he has side hustles in the Arctic and the jungle on wildlife and capacity building. He has been studying invasive wild pigs in Canada since 2010. Like all people from Saskatchewan, he never uses his turn signal in traffic, but leaves it on the entire time he drives down the Trans-Canada Highway. Sounds a lot like Northern Ontario drivers to me. So
maybe it's a Canada thing.
Maybe.
Great. Thanks so much.
Welcome.
Awesome. Good day, everyone. I really appreciate coming to Ontario and seeing a very different situation than what we have in the West, where we're really, quite frankly, overrun by wild pigs and we have a massive problem. Ontario's in a situation where we were about 25 years ago, and we sort of stood at a crossroads and said, well, do we want to really get aggressive and deal with this and eradicate and eliminate this problem, or do we want to just go status quo and see what happens? And we chose the latter option, and now we are essentially overrun with wild pigs. And just to put in context to some of the species we talked today about, imagine an emerald ash borer, but 127 million times bigger. That's basically what a wild pig is in a lot of ways, a really effective invasive species. This is a photo in Ontario that was taken. We received this from some of our national scale monitoring. So we do know that we have wild pigs in Ontario. We don't know exactly all of the locations, but day before yesterday, I was doing a talk at Trent University, and somebody from the audience said, oh, by the way, we have another trail camera photo of a wild pig that somebody saw in Peterborough. So the more you ask and the more you look around, there's probably a lot more than you think you have. Like many nocturnal species that are highly elusive, even though these things are easily upwards of or above 400 pounds, that doesn't mean that they're easy to spot or easy to know you have. Many people are surprised to learn that they're living in their area. So they aren't as obvious as you might hope in terms of detection. This is certainly the kind of scenario that I dearly hope that Ontario doesn't get into, where we see in the West, where we see extremely large groups of animals. Average weight of these would easily be, 140 to 180 kilos is nothing particularly huge for a wild boar, and we've seen much bigger. And I don't want to proceed without acknowledging our whole team. I've got several graduate students. We have lab and field technicians. We have helicopter crews, fixed-wing pilots, and a whole bunch of grassroots folks on the ground that they've really taken it on their own time and energy to deal with this really nasty invasive species in Western Canada. So just a little bit of terminology. A lot of folks here in the East have been calling them wild boar, and that's sort of true, but not really. We've really agreed to use the term wild pig as a generic catch-all because, as we'll sort of see from some of the photos, this species is a bit of a mess. They're all Suscrofa, the same species, but there has been quite a lot of crossbreeding going on between different groups. And so this is what we think of as a classic Eurasian wild boar. Native range is Europe and Asia, North Africa. So true wild boar, and these are raised on farms. And where it really started was in Canada in the late 80s and early 90s. There was a real tremendous push to diversify agriculture. They said you can't just have cows and canola, you have to have other things. And so we had ostrich farms and emu farms and reindeer and elk ranches, and wild boar were one of them. So that's the source. They're not native anywhere in North America. And so they're brought into in Canada and farmed, but unfortunately there were quite a number of escapes and purposeful releases where they cut the fence and just let them go. So that's been a start of the problem. But one last point I should say is that when they were brought over to be farmed, all of the experts said you need to cross them with a domestic pig at least once, and you'll get bigger animals, you'll get larger litter size, you get higher reproductive rates, and you get larger young, and so lots of benefits. Unfortunately, when you do that, you basically create a super boar or super pig because of all of those things that make them good for production also make them much, much more effective invasive species. If we actually really had true wild boar, we would have much less of a problem, and our efforts to try and control them would be much more effective. But unfortunately, that hybridization is actually one of the key causes of why this is going to be such a problem. So this is from a hunter collection in Saskatchewan, and you can notice it does not look like a Eurasian wild boar. This would have a large amount of domestic pig genetics, and they do, as I say, crossbreed quite effectively, both inside a fence and in the wild. And so we get a whole mix. And that's why we use this broad term wild pig. Anything that's a suid outside of a fence in Canada, we would call a wild pig. because often visually you can't tell. And certainly some of the ones that look like Eurasian wild boar almost certainly have at least some domestic pig in it. The other thing now that we're starting to detect also is potbelly pigs free ranging. There was just a group of 28 found in southern Saskatchewan that are running around as well, and they can also be highly invasive. And to add to the list is we have domestic pigs that have been farmed free range or open range type of access, and then they've been forgotten about or escaped or released or whatever. And this photo from one of our trail cameras is a classic example. So you see two in the front, very classic looking wild boar. Again, probably have some pig genetics, but certainly they're brown, gray, and very hairy, big, long snout. That one really bright one in the middle there, that's a Yorkshire domestic pig. That is has no relationship of any kind with wild boar. I was born and raised for hundreds of generations inside a domestic hog barn. And then in the back, you could see some with splotches and patches in different phases. And those are very clearly hybrids amongst all of them. So we do have a bit of a mess genetically. And one of our pieces of science is to look at the genetics and sort out what is the source of these animals and what are the implications of the hybridization. One of the other outcomes of hybridization is you get really, really big animals. And so shooting a 300 or 400 pound wild pig in Saskatchewan is, you're not really going to get a lot of attention for that or a lot of bragging rights. These are very, very common. And so these big animals have this tremendous capacity to survive cold winters as well. Perhaps surprisingly and ironically, the place where we see the most wild pigs in Canada is the place where we have by far the worst winters anywhere in Canada. And so we get these extremely cold periods where, being born and raised in the prairies, it is not unheard of to have 40 days where the temperature is never warmer than -30 in January and beyond. But yet these animals are obviously huge, very furry. They do extremely well under cold conditions. And that was one of the assumptions that unfortunately was made when they brought them over. They said, well, they'll never survive a Canadian winter. How could they possibly? But these are from Siberia. So I don't know that we should be completely surprised by that. And this is one we collared, one of the first animals we collared as part of our tracking study. And this animal is over 450 pounds. And again, that's a big animal, but is by no means the biggest. The biggest one we've handled in part of our team was 638 pounds. And so they can be really big. In the U.S., they actually have, if you ever have a chance, Google Hogzilla, and that's the single probably biggest one, and that's well over 1,000 pounds. So they can be incredibly big. This is a map 2012 now, and there's been some efforts to sort of update and improve on it because you notice, or hopefully you can see there are a bunch of question marks, but the black is the native range where we have true wild boar, and then everywhere else where they've been introduced. And so it is a global problem. I don't think there's any comparable or even close in terms of a large mammal invasive in terms of global success. They've been everywhere they've been introduced. They're a massive problem and a huge threat, and they expand very, very rapidly. 36 U.S. states have wild pigs right now, and that's expanding, and I'll show you some of the Canada data to back that up. So some recent work that just came out of the U.S., and this shows the scale of the problem in the U.S. They've had them more like 400 or 500 years in the U.S. They were brought over by Spanish explorers and introduced a few times. But California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, those places are completely overrun. Texas alone probably has somewhere in the order of 3 to 4 million wild pigs in its own. And so they don't talk about eradication. They talk about trying to minimize impacts and control high density issues, but any notion that they're going to eradicate is just completely off the table. And the yellow from this particular paper is projected range. And this is probably a bit hopeful, I would say. I might even use the word wishful thinking here, because one of the big problems they have in the US is not only natural spread, but people buying wild pigs, throwing them in a truck or a minivan, driving 2 or 3 states and releasing them to create hunting opportunities, which is exactly the problem I think Ontario should be very, very thoughtful about as well, because I think if that hasn't occurred already, I think there's a very real risk that could happen. And so, yeah, they can move naturally through spread, as this paper suggests. They can escape from farms, or they can be purposely transported, as I say, normally by hunters looking for an exciting new hunting opportunity. So lots of expansion, and this is a multi-billion-dollar problem in the U.S., everything from peanut production to impacts on alligator nests and turkey nests, and squirrel hunting is so big down there, and that's been impacts. White-tailed deer, lots and lots of biodiversity impacts as well on rare and invasive species. So very, very big concern in the U.S. And indeed, all of the funding that I get from my research in Canada comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture because of their massive concern about the spread of this, not only from the sources you see here, but when you add our Canada data, which I'll show you in a bit, now there's a very real risk of them moving down from Canada into filling those gaps in the north. And again, for up until very recently, the assumption was that the Montanas and the North Dakotas and the Minnesotas wouldn't be a real problem because of the winter conditions. But we've clearly shown from our work that is not the case at all. Here's from our research, my PhD student, Ruth Cost. This is a paper that's just coming out this month, actually, and this shows the spatial increase of wild pigs across Canada on the whole. So we're seeing massive, very, very rapid expansion. So again, we saw that introduction in the late 80s, early 1990s, then really nothing to speak of in terms of sightings. And then rapidly around 2010, we hit that critical mass, and that exponential curve starts to kick in with lots and lots of, because the reproductive rates are so high. These animals are having, on average in our study, 6 young per litter, and they're continuously breeding. So they're, as soon as they have a litter and those are weaned off, then they have another one. So it would be close to say they would have 3 litters in a single year, but certainly 3 litters in 450 days is not unheard of. So you're looking at, in the order of 15 young perhaps per year, something along those lines, and those become sexually mature at around 6 months of age. So one pregnant female can turn into 104 pigs in 2 years very, very quickly. So tremendous capacity, and again, that really comes from that hybridization part. If you have true wild boar, the reproductive rates are considerably lower in most cases. So here's Ruth's work mapping out across all of Canada sightings, and this is by watershed. These are level 9 watersheds mapped in red. We don't have any density attached, just currents. Any of the watersheds in Canada that show up in red just means we have a quite good confidence there's at least one sighting of wild pigs, which is tricky. And I think it's fair to say that these maps, while useful and by far the best thing available in Canada, we're missing some because, again, they're so elusive, often nocturnal under any kind of hunting pressure, any kind of disturbance, and they hit the heaviest, ugliest willow cover and tree cover and giant marshes that people just can't get into. And so we think that we probably, if anything, are missing some. And the more we search, the more we find. So there's the early period from 1990 to 2000. And as expected, farms were relatively new and still expanding, and numbers were low. But very, very quickly, through a lot of releases and escapes, and from natural reproduction that started very, very quickly, you start to see a lot of, in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, having by far the most. All provinces in Canada, at least at one point, were in the wild boar business on the domestic side, so inside a fence. There were wild boar in all cases, and in most provinces, it's still occurring. So that's quite a big deal. And then now in our most recent map, so this essentially is a snapshot of what we're seeing today across Canada, and notably Quebec and Ontario there, quite a number of watersheds that have been detected. And certainly more and more, just in the last few days, I've been hearing more sightings coming in all the time. And so as soon as this map is done, it's already out of date, and we're already working towards the next version and detecting lots of new sightings. And expansion, of course, in Saskatchewan is becoming to the point where it'll be almost easier soon to map the places in the southern half of the province where we don't have wild pigs than to identify the sites that do. So a few provinces are really on the edge where, again, they really, and Ontario is a really wonderful example where there's no question in my mind, having driven around the last few days visiting a number of different places in Ontario and looking at Google Earth and the ag production values, that I could very easily estimate that Ontario could support 1 million wild pigs without too much difficulty. I don't think that's an unfair estimate given what we know about them. And it doesn't take long to get there. Some of the impacts and risks, so these giant grain bags that we like to use in agriculture are great to leave in the field, except you can see on the top end, you can see pig footprints where they've walked across and broken through, and then where this side is just dumped out about maybe 500 billion calories worth of agricultural crop for them to feed on. So there's a massive subsidy to the population, and any notion of them having trouble surviving a winter goes out the window when they have access all winter to high value crops and lots and lots and lots of energy. Probably the thing that keeps me awake the most at night is worrying about the disease side. So this is a photo that I took a couple of years ago where a wild pig had jumped the fence and taken residence in a domestic pig operation, a backyard operation. About half of all pig production in Canada, about half of all the operations are outdoor variety, free range type situation, and the other half are high health barns, shower in, shower out, very, very high tight biosecurity, but fully half of those operations are like this, lots of contact potential. And if you've been following anything on the ag side, that African swine fever is a disease that's just emerged and is really, really frightening on the ag production, the pig production side. China is becoming overwhelmed. It's in wild boar in China. It's in wild boar in several countries in Europe, and spreading very, very rapidly. And certainly it would be catastrophic if it got into North America. And people are actually traveling with uncooked pork products on a regular basis. Just recently, there's a woman who was apprehended in an airport in Hawaii, traveling from Asia, and in her bag she had some uncooked pork, and they tested and had African swine fever. And people are, it is not uncommon for people traveling out of Asia to have uncooked pork available, and it's also very, very common within Asian countries to feed any household scraps back into the pigs as feed to pigs. And so if that occurred within Canada, it would very quickly, could easily become established. And also diseases that can affect humans. You know, there was a major E. coli outbreak in California a few years ago. It was wild pigs got into a spinach crop, defecated on it, and we had a major E. coli outbreak. Diseases to pets, certainly numerous, and to livestock and wildlife as well. So lots and lots of reasons not to like wild pigs in any way, shape, or form. This is the kind of damage they do. They will graze and feed on lots of different things. They will eat virtually anything. But when they get in on the ground on a pasture like this, unlike almost any other species in Canada, they're a rooter, and so they rip up that ground to get at roots and insect larvae and earthworms and that sort of thing, and they just tear the part of ground. So in agricultural lands and in native ecosystems, it's just absolutely devastating. This is just a relatively small group over a few nights, and they just tear it apart. Mostly doing that in night, as I say. This is in a provincial park in Manitoba called Spruce Woods, and they have probably several hundred established animals. But a group comes in and literally just tears that ground apart. And so the long-term destruction is really, really notable, especially in wetlands. They nest in wetlands, and they cut down cattails, and they'll eat the frogs, they'll eat salamanders, they'll eat ground nesting birds, anything they can get their mouth on, I should say, and consume anything. And so just really, really tremendous capacity. There's a photo that we obtained of white-tailed deer fawn being carried away. And so they will actually track down, and I know of people who have seen adult white-tailed deer taken down. And you can imagine, this is, you know, people ask, one of the common questions we get is, well, what about predators? Predators are going to kill these. Are predators going to come after animals of this size? You think of a 400, 500, 600-pound sow with Ginsu sharp knives. Those tusks are upwards of 11 inches long, and it's amazing when you hold those animals and you're restraining them. Those tusks are going like this nonstop, right? And those two leading edges are just going against each other all the time, and so they're constantly razor sharp. And so we were talking the other day, and I said, somebody asked about black bears when they get into the boreal forest, and I said my concern is probably more about risks to declining black bears than that bears would ever have any population control in these things. A, because of the high reproductive rate, and B, because they travel adult. There's typically a large female, and that's a good example of what we call a sounder. Lone males traveling around visiting different sounder groups, sexually mature males, I should say, and female groups normally led by one large adult female, and then her daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters, and then several, because they're just producing so many litters almost continuously, those young ones coming along as well. So yeah, it's a little bit frightening. This is actually a cemetery in Manitoba that was ripped up, and so the impacts are well beyond agriculture and natural ecosystems, but cultural values as well. And this is, again, just a small group literally came in one night and caused all that damage. This is what they can do to humans as well. They can be unbelievably aggressive. I wouldn't recommend it to do before bedtime, but Google wild boar charge and look at some of these animals that are, or wild pig charge. And they were, if you see a group of 4 and hunters shoot 3 of them, 1 survives, it will come right at you at full speed and try and kill you. Everybody in my group, except, I guess me, actually, I think I've been lucky so far, but everybody in my group's been charged. This was a gal in our crew that was just standing too close to one pig, and they were restraining the head. But what pigs like to do when they charge or when they're near is they just do this lift of the head, and because the tusks are the sharp tusks coming out of the bottom jaw, they try and get you inside the leg and nick that femoral artery. And so she was very lucky. It came close, and she was wearing about 5 different pairs of pants. It was minus 25. And so a relatively small cut, but about a dozen stitches or something like that cleaned up. But I had a team of summer students out this summer just picking up some drop GPS collars, and they were charged by about a 400-pound male. And luckily in that case, it just started screaming at them and ran right between and kept going. But certainly real potential for human health risk. That's sort of a quick and brief overview of kind of the ecology of them and how they operate. Now I'm just going to give at least some of my thoughts from we're the only group of scientists, myself and my 2 grad students essentially, we're the only ones in Canada doing any research that I'm aware of on wild pigs. So here's some thoughts in terms of what might be done about it. Certainly, and this slide is blank because right now we are in a massive void of a vacuum of leadership on this issue. Nobody's really doing anything about it in terms of sort of governments or NGOs or any of the groups. It's really, for the most part, across all of Canada, it's really been sort of everybody's ignoring and hope it'll go away. So there isn't a lot to share in terms of leadership because there really hasn't been much yet. I will say, though, that there's been some interesting steps forward in Ontario. And certainly one of the biggest challenges with this issue right off the bat is owning it and admit you have a problem. And our governments in the West are mostly in full denial. But here in Ontario, they've been promoting it, and I'll show some examples of where we've seen some signs of that. We have what used to be a 300-pound wild boar, now he's on wheels, that we travel around and do a lot of education and try and communicate and have people understand the risks of these. A lot of hunters say, wow, this is fantastic, wild pigs, this is great. And then we start to explain the impacts of white-tailed deer and goose hunting and duck hunting, and they go, oh, maybe this isn't such a great thing. So certainly the communication piece is a big one. Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters has been promoting over the year. They've really taken some real leadership in Ontario and really recognized this, and they're asking for sightings, which has been great. And the provincial government, I noticed there, has created a reporting site, which is also great. The only major criticism I will say of this, other than it's really good they're owning it and putting it up, but as far as I could tell from my travels this week, is that there's no actual plan on what to do when they're sighted. And so I think that's certainly the big gap and the big next step that's needed on Ontario, is to say, okay, well, great, everybody called 911 and reported a bunch of fires. Now what the heck do we do about it? And it certainly normally would be good to have a plan before you ask. And so that's, to my mind, the major step forward for Ontario. And really, we were talking about it yesterday, and somebody said, well, how do you narrow it down just to a few things? And I said, find pigs however way you can and kill pigs and continue and repeat. And you've got to find them fast. And the notion of sort of comparing them to a fire is, I think, appropriate, and more so than any other sort of way of thinking in terms of wildlife, is that really, I say if you're telling a story about pigs, and just sort of replace pigs with fire in your province or your area with your house. So imagine calling 911 and saying, well, we've only had we only have 4 small fires in our house, so I don't think we're that concerned yet. That just sounds ridiculous. Even one sighting of a pig in Ontario should be cause for massive alarm. Alarm bells should go off, and then certainly if there's any hope and dream of not becoming a Saskatchewan situation, within 10 to 12 years, then there definitely has to be that immediate effort. And the window to do that is very short. You saw the graph and the figures in Saskatchewan especially, where over a very, very short period, they went from essentially what Ontario is now, a few sightings, a couple of watersheds, a few red flags going off, to widespread and, tremendous densities all over the southern half of the province. So this is the kind of images that we get. Certainly a comprehensive risk assessment is definitely needed. Everywhere. That hasn't been done anywhere in Canada, really. But you look at that, it's big groups of, that's one litter from one female in the sounder, and then some of her daughters and granddaughters. But see the size of these animals and the tremendous reproductive capacity. As I say, we're the only ones doing any kind of research and monitoring, but certainly happy to collaborate with anybody that's interested. We use a technique called Judas pigs, where we capture them with the net gun, put a GPS collar and let them go, and then you can track them and use them to locate other groups of animals. And so you could collar one, eliminate them, let them go, and continue to use that Judas pig to find. Nothing finds wild pigs better than a wild pig by any stretch. We got lots of options out there and lots of tools in the toolbox you could use, but certainly nothing comes close in terms of using wild pigs to find other wild pigs. So it can be very, very effective. One of the big focus has to switch from this notion of thinking about wildlife management to pig management, which is whole sounder removal. And our program and most programs that are effective is that if there's a group of 13 and you kill 12, you say, sorry, we wasted our time and money. That's would be considered a 100% failure. If we have a 98, 99% success rate in taking out a sounder, then that is literally considered a total failure. Anything less than 100% is a waste of everybody's time and money. So you have to find a way, and these big panel traps can be very, very effective at capturing entire groups. Otherwise, with those reproductive rates, you see 13 and you kill 10, that you come back in a year, maybe 2 years, and you'll have 2 or 3 times as many as you had before. Land access is a challenge, especially in Ontario and across, well, all the provinces where you have mostly private land. If people are saying no access, then there's going to be a few source populations. Disease testing is a big one. There has been a sum total of 0 wild pigs in Canada ever tested for key reportable diseases. There's been a little bit of work in Saskatchewan to test for some non-reportable kind of, with some things that are important, but not the key reportables. So we have a big, giant gaping gap there, especially in the face of things like bovine TB and concerns about other diseases I mentioned. So those are sort of that's a pretty quick snapshot of some ideas that I'm, suggest. I've had a lot of people chatting with over the last 4 days, visiting around Ontario, and had, I don't know, roughly 1.4 billion questions thrown at me about pigs, and really a fair bit of concern. And the biggest, most common is, what do we do about it? That's just some thoughts. But certainly if folks are interested in seeing some of the papers we published or hearing more about it, just let me know anytime. So thanks very much. Do we have time for a question?
Yeah, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I had a question about the distribution maps. I see there's, a ton of pigs in the southern U.S., Texas, Florida, then there's a huge gap, and then a ton of pigs in Saskatchewan. So why is there that gap between?
Oh, I think it's, there's this propagular pressure hypothesis that really ties the spread of an invasive species to the source. And I think that's probably what it is the source has clearly in the southern U.S. been. Now, what is less known is why it's spread so rapidly recently. So those, the California, the Texas, the Florida, they have had them for well over 300 years. And they've slowly spread to some of the southern states. And then since the 80s to now, there's been this explosion of spread. I don't know why that is. Now, I don't think anybody has a great sense. It might be climate change. It's probably a lot of assisted movements. So now they're slowly spreading north. In Canada, we had a different situation where we've had all these wild boar farms all over southern Canada, and those are clearly the source. We developed a habitat predictive map of pigs in Saskatchewan, and it did a far worse job of predicting where pigs are than just simply making a map of where the farms are. So yeah, but when we reach some kind of equilibrium, whatever that is going to look like, I think all of that gap is going to fill. There's no reason ecologically why they won't fill in there eventually. But yeah, yes, sir.
Do you think increased numbers has to do with the fact that there's trail cam technology and they've always been there? It's just people didn't know, or it wasn't photographed so much?
That's a great question. That's probably a small part of that, for sure. That the harder and better we look, the more we find. But these animals are, in many cases, at least in the western provinces, certainly that photo I showed, the very first slide in Ontario, was in the middle of broad daylight. So people are seeing them. And that was actually taken with a camera, not a trail cam. So
the one with the big herd of them moving through, that was from Ontario?
That great big group, no, that was actually in BC. Yeah. No, but so a lot of our photos, and certainly in Saskatchewan, the very first study we did, half of all trail cam photos were in daylight, and the rest were at night. And so I think that's a fair point. That the harder we look and the better we look with drones and aircraft and forward-looking infrared and all these things, we will find more to a point. But there's pretty clearly been a big expansion, and that fits with theory. Ecological theory, like the propagule pressure hypothesis, it also fits perfectly with every other area on Earth that we've seen, right? We take one more if there is. Yes, sir.
With the crop damage or the harvest crop damage that I was seeing in a couple of your images, the farmers trying to eradicate locally?
There are some that are trying to eradicate. One big issue in Saskatchewan is that we compensate in our province 100% for the value of crop loss. So that does eliminate a lot of potential appetite for addressing some of the issues. Also, if you talk to our provincial government, they say, I don't know what Ryan's talking about. We have really no big issue. We've only
Is there a similar hunting season open for the here in Ontario and say across Canada?
well, I can answer that in two ways. Is there and should there be are very two different questions. I don't think there should be any sport hunting of wild pigs at all. I think that if your goal is to have lots and lots of wild pigs and create a really exciting hunting opportunity and have 1 million pigs in Saskatchewan and make it a big revenue generator, then the best thing you could do is open up to sport hunting today and promote the heck out of it. And hunters go in and they see 10, they're out deer hunting and they spot 10, they shoot 4, and those groups break up and they scatter and they move 20, 30, 40, 70 kilometers and they spread a field. And so that's the perfect way to break up and spread animals. So any states that have had any success have eliminated hunting and banned it completely. So that's, I think, the should part, which you didn't ask. So I'm good at answering questions that nobody asked me. But the question you did ask was, what is the current status? And I don't believe you can shoot them in defensive property in Ontario, as I understand, which is probably open to a lot of vague interpretation. I believe they're not open to hunting, but there's not that many that we can tell. But in the prairies, we have wide open hunting, 365 days a year, no limits. You only have to follow general firearms guidelines. But so you see the Saskatchewan situation. So if you're looking for any evidence that sport hunting controls populations, you will not find any evidence of that in Canada. In fact, very much the opposite. The more sport hunting you do, the more pigs you have. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much. Take care. A gift. All right. Thank you very much. Perfect.
Hey, David, you're just gonna want to make sure we can Fiona is visible.
Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly introduce you. Sorry, Fiona, we're just transitioning rooms. Give us a minute or two.
No problem.
Yeah, and nothing makes it like anything that is. That's your problem moving forward. They've been really well established in provincial parks. We don't have any national parks so far. We're probably about 18 months away from our first national park in the west. That would be Prince Albert National Park. Sightings 5 miles to the west. And in the open grasslands, Spruce Woods has lots of provincial parks in Saskatchewan. But yeah, definitely once they get in there, they just disappear. Spruce Woods, a guy I know in the provincial government, a wildlife guy, he went into Spruce Woods deer hunting last winter, and they saw a group of way over 100 birds. And they said, okay, everybody save 4 bullets each so we can get out of here safe with their necks intact, and shoot until you run out of bullets. And as soon as you do, signal, jump in. So they shot and shot and shot. And I don't think they went back to check. They killed everything they could and ran the hell out of there. Didn't go back for a while. So, yeah. I don't wish that on my worst enemy, that's for sure. So, you guys, because one part, we were just talking about this last night that I'm aware of is this voyageur part. Yeah.
Yeah, so voyageur is sort of nestled in those farms. I kind of aware of some of the.
Yeah, we've reached out to them and just say, hey, can we help? And well, can we help? And can we have some ears for our genetic analysis? And nobody's responded at all. I mentioned they're giving it a lot of calls from the one and hunt them or whatever. No interest so far.
Yeah, well, it's called pressure. Reach up there. And we're being shifted from one ministry to another. Everything, a lot of things are.
Hey, real pleasure. Thanks for coming. Good to see you later.
Say hi to my wife. I will.
Take care. Wow, that's a huge area. Yeah. And
So
how many
I'm
cars?
still going to the Palmer.
Wow. And you have what, 300 staff?
Okay, one season.
One season.
There are no part-timers.
So you have to work with the other agencies to get any kind of wildlife. So if you needed to do a case study.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
The thing is, we're part of Ontario. Sure, just one research-based university, too. Everybody. And then the other
We're coming on some big coast of Manitoba.
Yes, thank you. $20,000 bill.
Is there's no commercial flight?
Oh, there's for me to go up there.
You're very
A trip up there. We just finished a major project. But the people did have high PCBs.
So it's money well spent, but could have been, but it couldn't have cost $100 million to cause the entire development. That probably cost a fraction of that.
Well, back in the 50s.
Nope, we're just waiting on this room to wrap up over here.
I wasn't.
Nice to meet you. Take care.
Yep.
Behind schedule next door.
Very good.
Yesterday,
No, we do not have Monday.
spoke to the mine. That went well.
They did. Western report came back. I didn't go to it yesterday, but Gabby and Vicky did. And it sounds good. They could have had the room twice this time.
Yeah, I heard that. They were having a pretty good rate, so popular.
Classes that want to come.
Yeah. Good news for next year.
Probably been learning. Unless we're trying to split between all the different sessions today, so we're studying each one so we can then kind of combine notes after.
Did she start?
No, just got my wires crossed, it's where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. So,
Is she on there? Yeah, she's just waiting on the line. She's gonna say, "Oh, I don't
Fiona,
Yes,
it's Chris McQuarrie. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. I heard you were talking, so I wanted to come say hello. If you were here in person, I'd come shake your hand. But
No, I couldn't get permission. Sad day, but
are you
reality.
going to be at Pest Forum?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll be there. Yeah.
Okay.
Very nice.
I've managed to get everything I need from Martha.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that.
Yeah,
Just
they're
the other day. So.
going to send us the. I'm not going to send the crew out to get the bugs out of the 3 trees that are left. They're just going to send them to us.
Oh, that's good. So they're gonna package them up.
Yeah, because they're just wee.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
I was expecting our big trees, but they're just tiny. So.
it's unfortunate.
Yep.
I shouldn't say it's unfortunate we haven't found more. That's not.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go sit down.
Okay.
Hi, Fiona. It's David from the Invasive Species Center. So we're going to get started with your presentation. Sorry for the delay. We've had a couple concurrent sessions running, and the people next door are running a little bit over time. But to keep on track, we're going to get started. So your presentation is also going to be recorded, so anybody who's missed it will be able to watch it after the fact.
Okay.
So I'll do a quick introduction before we get started. Fiona works with the Manitoba Sustainable Development, overseeing the province's forest health program for the past 7 years as the pest management biologist. Fiona has experience working with various stakeholders on numerous urban and commercial forest pest issues, including gypsy moth, jack pine budworm, and now emerald ash borer. Fiona also represents Manitoba on various national forest health committees and working groups. She holds a BSc in environmental science with a focus in forest ecology from the University of Winnipeg. And Fiona is going to be talking to us today about Manitoba's response to emerald ash borer and learning from neighbors. So Fiona, when you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. And I know I'm very happy that I can do this presentation, even if even if I'm doing it from Manitoba. So it's nice that we could connect this way. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown. I'm going to talk really quickly about EAB, talk about the ash in Manitoba, the current situation that we're finding in Manitoba, and sort of some of the actions that we are doing here for EAB management. So I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but I thought I would put up there anyways. Emerald ash borer is an invasive beetle. It's originally from Asia. It was first detected in North America in 2002, and it's very good at killing ash trees, as we are seeing sort of, all across Ontario and Quebec, and now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, everywhere. And here's just sort of an updated map of where EAB is currently regulated for in Canada. And as you can see, Winnipeg, which is the one spot in Manitoba that is regulated for emerald ash borer, is pretty far from the initial infestation and any spread from there. So, there is some good thought that it was brought into Manitoba through human-aided movement. And that is sort of one of our focuses of our EAB management plan is really looking at the source and likelihood of the infestation spreading in the province and what is most likely to spread it. We know that it came to North America most likely on wood products, and dunnage is what they think, and that firewood is a good vector. In Manitoba, we are landlocked. We don't really have any major ports. We have one port up in Churchill, but it doesn't get too much activity, I don't think. So one of the main risks for Manitoba is the spread of firewood and different wood products coming into the province from other areas that have different invasive species. So one of the things that Manitoba did have that is a little helpful is that we had some time. So when EAB was introduced or discovered in 2002, we had some time in Manitoba to assess what really was at risk. So, you know, those of us in the forestry branch, we knew that Manitoba had a lot of ash trees. We knew that we had 2 native ash trees, the green and black ash. And then we also knew that we had lots of urban forests and shelter belts that had a lot of ash. And that photo is one of the biggest ash trees that we have found in Manitoba. It's very big. It's on the Selkirk Golf Course. If anyone ever wants to come to Manitoba and go golfing in Selkirk, you probably can still see that guy. Yeah. So what we did to assess that risk of what we were at risk of losing really when EAB was introduced was to take a look at where the ash was in Manitoba. So this is just from our forest inventory. It's all the ash stands in Manitoba. That's the dark green areas here. And then the little sort of specks in between, those are shelter belts that we know have a component of ash as part of them. So we know that in Manitoba, there's no natural break of ash that will limit the spread of EAB whatsoever. It really will affect the whole province as a whole. We also did a survey, and so this is about 10 years old now. We did this survey in 2008, 2009, where we went to 17 different communities, and we actually counted the ash trees within these communities. So the communities were of different population sizes, but we really wanted to get an understanding of how much ash was in different communities. For numerous years, we have an active Dutch elm disease management program here in Manitoba. And for numerous years, we knew that communities had been replacing their elms that they were losing from Dutch elm disease to ash. So what we just didn't know was sort of how much ash was within these communities. So this is just an example. This is the city of Winkler now. But 10 years ago, it had a population of 9,100. And it had 10,000 ash trees, and that's all the green dots. So the community itself is going to be very affected when EAB moves to it. And we just did a couple population size. This is a small town called Carmen. Again, population about 2,000 people, and it had almost 3,000 ash trees planted in it. And then what it doesn't even count for is this forested area here. We know there's a lot of ash within this forested area. So we know there's more ash within that community than we even counted. These were just planted trees. And then where EAB is in the city of Winnipeg, where it's been confirmed, we know that the city of Winnipeg has approximately 150,000 public ash trees, and then we're about the same in private ash trees. So we know that there's a lot of ash trees that are going to have to be dealt with within the city of Winnipeg. So we did have the time to confirm that our suspicions of the amount of ash we had in Manitoba were more or less correct. So here's just some figures from the survey that we did. So we do know that in total we surveyed 56,000 ash trees. We did find that there was roughly a 50-50 split between trees that would be considered owned privately and then those that would be considered publicly owned trees. We did do a shelter belt survey as well because there's lots of shelter belts across Manitoba, and they are very important actually for erosion control, and as well actually shelter belts are being planted here in Manitoba to help control whiteouts from the winter and the snow time with the wind blowing. So there's many useful aspects of shelter belts. But anyways, we found that shelter belts that were older than 30 years of age contain less ash than those that were younger. So the newer shelter belts almost comprise completely of ash. So we are at risk of losing all these shelter belts. And the reason for that increase is that there was a program called the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation PFRA Association, I think is the right word. And they were distributing trees at very low cost or free to farmers to plant for shelter belts, and ash was one of the main species that they distributed across the prairies. So we know that according to our tree inventory, our provincial tree inventory, that we have approximately 217,000 hectares of green and black ash forests. And these forests, as I mentioned before, are found across our river, along our riverways and river bodies. These areas have already been affected by Dutch elm disease, so we've lost a lot of our mature elms in these areas. So now we're also going to be losing our ash in these areas as well. We know that the city of Winnipeg has a lot of ash trees, so we know in general Manitoba has a lot of ash. So we knew that there was quite a lot at risk when EAB did arrive in Manitoba. Some of the other things that we did do before the arrival of EAB was that we introduced legislation. So in 2009, I believe the Forest Health Protection Act became an act in Manitoba. And what this act does is it does provides the province the authority to manage forest pests, including invasive species, on public and private property. Some other things is we've been doing monitoring before EAB, because I mean, if you don't know it's here, you're not looking for it, how can you be sure it's not there? We also did a lot of staff education, so we made sure our staff were aware of EAB, sort of within our branch, and then also within the department as a whole. And we have done a lot of education and public outreach, so trying to make sure that arborists were aware of the risk of EAB and like what to look for and how to report it. And we also did the same thing with the public. And then we also met with various stakeholders and partner organizations, and we prepared a Manitoba's Emerald Ash Borer Preparedness Plan, which is actually just up on our website. If you just Google Manitoba and EAB, it will take you to the government website, and you're welcome to look through it. One of the most valuable parts is that we sort of formed partnerships before EAB arrived in Manitoba. And then also because we had introduced legislation that was very similar to the Plant Protection Act, it did allow us to sort of work through different scenarios with our federal counterparts to figure out how our pieces of legislation could work together instead of sort of going on top of each other. We really want to work together to help strengthen pieces of legislation. So that's a quick snapshot. We've done a lot of things before EAB. So we had 10 years or more than that to prepare for the arrival of EAB, and we were sort of continuously trying to do that. And then last year we found it, which was a sad day here in Manitoba. So this slide here is just an outline of the activities that sort of have happened since the arrival of EAB. But I'm going to talk about them a bit more in the next slides. So this is just sort of a quick snapshot of all the things that have been going on and that are continuing to go on actually here. So last November, we're almost 1 year, EAB was officially confirmed in the city of Winnipeg. And actually the way that the tree was found was through a public inquiry. So someone called the city of Winnipeg 311, so they have like a general inquiry line, and said that they had a really sick tree on their boulevard. And when city technicians went to look at it, it did not look very well. And then we sort of met and took some samples and pulled some larvae from the infested tree. So that is this guy here. And as you can see, it has a lot of woodpecker damage on it. And so then those larvae were sent off for DNA testing just to confirm that it was EAB. So then, we actually had some great help from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as well as the Canadian CFS, Canadian Forest Service, sorry, to provide training for us. So we've done a lot of training beforehand, but now that it was here, we really want to have the experts on hand to provide some really great training and concrete and just refresher and make sure we knew what we were doing. So the CFIA came out and they trained us all on a visual survey, which really does sort of just find, we know at most, it will find the most obvious trees. With the visual survey, really what we're looking for is this tree, the most obvious tree that's within an area. We did find another 3 trees from the visual survey. So like there's this guy here where a piece of the bark was pulled off, maybe by a squirrel or something, and you could make out an S-shaped gallery, but only with binoculars. So we've sort of adapted the visual survey as sort of a quick and dirty way to take a good look at trees around the province. So we have done the visual survey for the city of Winnipeg, and then as well for the sort of communities within 30 kilometers of the city of Winnipeg, as well as we have a couple of provincial parks. So we've gone and looked at those campgrounds quite closely and other areas within the parks, just to see if there was anything that was jumping out as being infested with EAB now that we knew it was in the province. Yeah, and so from our visual survey last year, we haven't actually found any additional really obvious trees. I like to call them the beacon trees. And we're doing it again actually this year in some different areas, and we haven't found anything as well. We also we got some really great branch sampling training, so we all refreshed that methodology and practice peeling branches. And so we did that to try and find additional infested trees. We haven't actually found very many. So so within the initial infested area, where EAB is sort of seen as a hotspot, or where we know it is, we did sort of 10 trees per kilometer squared. Out of that, we found 13 trees, which isn't very many. I don't know what the streets are like over there, but our streets are pretty much lined with ash. So if you think that you have, 30 blocks, just nothing but green ash, and only 13 of those trees have been found to have EAB in them, it's just interesting. Yeah. So this is just a picture of where EAB is in the city of Winnipeg. Other areas of the city have been sampled, but they actually haven't found any positive trees within any of the other areas. We do have another invasive that's currently running through Manitoba called cottony ash psyllid. So there is a lot of declining black ash currently in Manitoba, and the city actively went out and branch sampled areas that had a lot of declining black ash as well as some of the green ash in the areas, and they didn't find any signs of EAB. Yeah, so that's just a picture. That's sort of their map of where they sampled. The yellow dots are where they sampled and there was nothing, and then the red dots, and then the red dots are where they've had a confirmed tree. But yeah, the population seems, I don't want to say it seems low, but it doesn't. Doesn't seem to be super abundant everywhere, like we would have expected, I think, especially because that initial tree that we did pull those larvae out of, if you think of like a 1 by 1 foot section as what we peeled the bark off of, and I would say we probably pulled easily 6 or 7 larvae out of that tree at that point, and that was just at DBH. So the tree in theory would be just riddled with EAB all the way down to sort of your eyesight. Yeah, so yeah. The city of Winnipeg is going, has come up with their city management of Emerald Ash Borer. So they have been removing ash trees. They have been injecting ash trees. And then they are sort of figuring out how they're going to manage the injection program in future years, and if people are going to be allowed to, to inject some trees on their own. They're still figuring some things out, but they did start injecting trees this year, and they have started removing trees. So all those trees with the red dot have been removed. They were removed by March, actually, last year. So, yeah. So moving forward, provincially, our goal is to slow the spread across the province. We don't think we're going to be able to stop it. We don't think that's a reasonable thing or reasonable expectation on our part. So really moving forward, we're really just working hard at trying to slow the spread across the province. So we sort of have a very common three-stage approach. We're going to do some monitoring, we're going to do a lot of prevention, and we're also going to do some regulation where possible. So for monitoring, so this is just a snapshot of where we placed traps this past summer. So we put out 139 traps. This was in private campgrounds, public campgrounds, and then different communities across Manitoba, cottage areas. Really, we try and target areas where we think firewood is moving or where people are moving stuff. And then we target major cities as well, because we know stuff's moving in and out of them. We didn't find any adults on any of our traps. What is really interesting is the city of Winnipeg put up 200 traps across the city, and I think that's less than a kilometer apart pretty much for each trap. And then within that sort of, within this known infested area, they put up an additional 40 traps, thinking that we would catch a lot of beetles, and all that they caught were 2 beetles. So that's a very interesting question. And then we always partner with the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and they put out 40 traps, and they're going to increase that next year. I'm going to be like, when we don't normally, I don't actually know when you're supposed to find EAB, but I think finding EAB in the middle of sort of what is winter in Manitoba, because November it's nice and cold already. We already have a foot of snow. Is a little rare, so they already allocated their traps, so they put up 40 as well. So one of the other things that we are really working hard towards is prevention, because we know that if we can get the word out and talk to people and let them know of the risks, that we can hopefully slow the spread across Manitoba. So we do a lot of outreach. So we've been leading training sessions with municipal staff from across Manitoba on sort of what to look for, things to consider when they're doing management for EAB or the planning that they should be doing now that EAB is within the province. We've really been stressing tree inventories because realistically, most of municipalities and communities, if they don't know what's there, it's going to be really hard to understand what they have at risk and what they need to manage. We are working on a pilot project to develop a tree inventory template and database for municipalities in Manitoba. So we're just still working out sort of the kinks, but the idea is there, so hopefully that will work out. We've also been reaching out to industry. We've been meeting with nurseries and arborists and the firewood industry, and what we're trying to do is originally we were trying to make sure everyone knew that Emerald Ash Borer had been confirmed within the city of Winnipeg, and now we're going to be reaching out to the arborists even more to make sure that they understand the rules of being regulated by the CFIA. And what they should be doing as they're cutting ash within the city of Winnipeg, that they can't be moving that product outside the city of Winnipeg and the risks and so on. So we will be planning additional outreach events with arborists because from discussions, there's some confusion about the rules. So we're going to do some more public outreach. Nothing wrong with that. We also do a lot of general public outreach. We've actually always been doing public outreach for numerous years, and just sort of as the past couple of years, we've really just switched the message to don't move firewood. We have this sort of, I want to be like, stylized invasive species campaign that is linked up actually with our zebra mussels campaign. So we're trying to have sort of a common website for invasive species within Manitoba to have sort of one-stop shop. So we do presentations to special interest groups and to the public. We attend a lot of trade shows and outreach events. We, talk to boaters. We go to the boat show and the RV show, and we talk to all sorts of people just so they know the risks associated with moving firewood in particular and any other wood products. We have some community signs. We're up on social media. And then our newest one that we just got is we're doing pop-up ads. Oh, it should say pop-up ads, not pop-ups. Okay, anyways. Ads on Kijiji. So when people go to search for firewood, they should get a pop-up ad, which is this one at the bottom here that says "Don't move firewood." Sort of just to give people more to look at. And then the last sort of piece that we can do provincially is regulations. So I did mention earlier that we have the Forest Health Protection Act here in Manitoba, and that is our act that oversees forest health issues, so invasive species as well as native insects. And so what we did is we've done some amendments to those regulations. So we have changed one of the regulations so that you cannot import ash from Ontario, Quebec, and the U.S. states that are affected with emerald ash borer. The Ontario and Quebec change we actually made before we found EAB here. We really just wanted to reduce the risk of infested products moving into Manitoba. And then we added the U.S. states. That was actually the major change there. And then we also changed our regulation to restrict the movement of ash from the CFIA regulated areas. So that means that legally in Manitoba, you cannot be moving ash from the city of Winnipeg, which is the only CFIA regulated area within the province. But as EAB spreads across Manitoba, that we won't have to make the change again. That will just apply to all CFIA regulated areas. And really these changes in our regulations really, we think, just sort of dovetail with the federal regulations. They sort of do the same thing, but it does give us provincially the ability to do some enforcement if necessary and talk to people and let them know that no, it is against the law. You can't be moving these products. And yeah, get some weight behind us. Oh, and the future. So we are doing lots and lots and lots for the future. So we are continuing to build partnerships. EAB is not something that the province can just manage on its own. It's everyone has to help the public, other foreign levels of government, non-for-profit groups. It really, everyone just needs to work together to provide information to anyone who wants it. We are going to continue with, education. We really want to make sure that everyone knows the risks about emerald ash borer, especially because it doesn't seem to have spread really across the city of Winnipeg. So maybe we have some possibilities here that other parts of Canada didn't see, because I want to say maybe we caught it early. I don't know, maybe anyways, there's lots of possibilities there. We are trying, different forms of outreach. So if anyone has any good ideas for outreach, we're always very open to them. Our newest one is, I'm going to call it the Green Ribbon Campaign. It's that picture at the bottom. So it will go around ash trees to help create awareness at what is at risk for different communities. And we've seen it in other areas, and it seemed like a really good campaign and got a lot of good traction. We're going to have some new Don't Move Firewood signs for our provincial parks that are a little more targeted for the firewood moving in and out of the parks. We will be continuing to monitor for emerald ash borer, and then we are going to be also continuing training for local governments, industry, volunteer groups. We really want to have as many eyes on the ground looking for EAB that we can get. And then there's lots of questions about EAB. The big one is, will the cold in Manitoba kill it? No, we don't. We know that it won't kill it, but you know, what will it for sure have a 2-year life cycle? What will that implications be for management? There's lots of questions, so we are supporting your research for EAB. And I think that that's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We have a couple minutes if there's any questions. I don't think so. So if you have any questions for Fiona, you can contact her by her email address on the screen. So thanks again, Fiona, for taking the time to call in today.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me and allowing me to do it via the internet.
Yeah, for sure. So this was our last session today. So we're going to wrap up in the next room. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.